Have you ever wondered how far a Christian woman should go to save her marriage? Where does faith extend? And where does self-deception begin? My name is Sarah Thompson. I'm 39 years old, a mother of 2 boys, a Sunday school teacher, and for a long time, I was seen as a woman of unwavering faith, the one who prayed, fasted, held vigils, always with a smile on her face and a Bible in her hands. But what no one saw was what I faced inside my home when the church lights went out and the silence of pain embraced me in the darkness. Behind the surface, my marriage was falling apart, and I clung to every verse as if it could stitch together the pieces of a love that was no longer there. While I prayed, he lied. While I fasted, he cheated. And I told myself, God will change this. I just need to believe a little more. Maybe you're experiencing something similar. Or maybe you know someone who's going through exactly this right now, believing that suffering in silence is proof of holiness, that enduring abandonment is part of God's purpose. But is that really true? What you're about to discover may surprise you, because the truth is that not all pain is a cross, and not all silence is virtue. Stay with me until the end, because this story goes beyond betrayal, abandonment, and faith. It's about awakening, about courage, about a woman who had to lose everything to finally find herself and find God again, but in a completely different way. I know it's not always easy to talk about this within the church. I know the fear, the guilt, the judgment, but today I decided to tell my story unfiltered because maybe, just maybe, it's the answer you've been praying for so long. And it all started like this. We met at church, in one of those services that leaves a mark on your soul. He sang in the worship team, and I could barely take my eyes off him. He had a strong presence, a firm voice, and a serene way of speaking about God that captivated everyone around him. He was charismatic, always smiling, always with the right words on the tip of his tongue. He seemed tailor-made for a woman like me, Christian, dedicated, a dreamer. And for some reason, I was certain he was a gift from God for my life. Everything seemed to fall into place too quickly, as if time were in a hurry. We prayed together, fasted together, made plans based on faith, ministry commitments, and the verses he always quoted with such conviction. And in the midst of it all, I surrendered. My heart filled with hope, and my mind immersed in the idea of a divine purpose for that relationship. Because as you grow in faith, you learn to believe that everything that begins in church already comes with a seal of blessing. I believed this with all my being. He said I was the answer to his prayers, and I, filled with emotion, reciprocated with promises of fidelity, submission, and constant prayer. It was as if we were living one of those testimonial stories we hear in couples services. But what no one ever says is that not every beautiful beginning has a blessed ending. Sometimes, the appearance of purpose hides much harsher realities, hidden truths that only reveal themselves with time. For the first few months, everything was harmonious. He was kind, attentive, and made a point of praying before any decision, big or small. And me? I was enchanted. I saw in this man the image of the spiritual leader every Christian woman dreams of having by her side. It was as if, finally, God had heard my prayers. But deep down, something didn't add up. Small details that seemed trivial. The phone always face down, deleted messages, vague excuses for changes in plans. But at that stage, I ignored them. I didn't want to ruin it. After all, who am I to distrust a man of God? My mind was completely shaped by a mindset that confused faith with blindness. Believing was, in effect, turning a blind eye to the signs and repeating to myself, it's just the enemy trying to attack what God started. And that's exactly where many of us fall, when we mistake discernment for judgment, when we accept small lies in the name of great hope. Over time, I realized that what kept me there wasn't just love. It was the illusion of living something God had ordained. It was the fear of making a mistake if I questioned it. And it was also the weight of expectations, from the church, from family, from the community. Because when everyone sees you as the blessed couple, you start doing everything to Maintain that image, even if, behind the scenes, reality is crumbling. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. In the early years, I felt like I was living in one of those stories you hear as a testimony at the end of a service. The marriage felt like an extension of church. Prayers before meals, praise around the house, devotions for two. He was still that eloquent man who knew how to use verses like few others, and I was proud of that. It was easy to believe we were building something eternal with a solid, unshakable foundation. I told my friends I felt like the most blessed woman in the world, and in a way I truly believed it. The emotional impact of finally experiencing what I'd always hoped for blinded me to any cracks that were beginning to appear in the structure. It's curious how we ignore the details in the name of hope. He began spending more time away, always with excuses related to ministry, meetings, rehearsals, visits, and, since I was that wife who wanted to be a suitable helper, I never questioned it. On the contrary, I prayed that God would strengthen him on his journey. I felt honored to be by the side of a man so used. But what I didn't realize was that all of this was just surface level. Behind the scenes, another story was being written. A story I had no idea was happening, but which, from time to time, gave small signs. There was a subtle distance, which I attributed to fatigue, half-hearted conversations, colder glances, and intimacy that gradually became routine, then obligation, then absence. But for me, it was just a phase. Marriages go through this, don't they? That's what I'd always heard. And within the church, no one talked about marital crises in depth, much less when it involved someone so respected. So I did what I'd always known. I prayed. I intensified my fasts. I began seeking spiritual strategies to keep the flame alive that, in truth, was already almost extinguished. This was the most dangerous phase of the journey, the phase in which faith began to be used as a shield to justify everything, even that which hurt too much to ignore. I hid within spiritual practices as if that were enough to transform what, deep down, had already become dysfunctional. And he knew this. He knew that my surrender to God was blinding me to his inconsistencies. He knew that all he had to do was quote a passage, mention a difficult time, ask for prayer, and I would immediately take up intercession and forget about questioning. The hidden truth was that my marriage was built more on image than substance, and when image is all that exists, any small crack becomes a threat. But even so, I clung to the idea that this was still God's dream for me, that all the pain was part of a greater plan. This mindset imprisoned me, and the subtlest part is that it came disguised as faith, obedience, fidelity to a purpose I no longer knew was real. I began to carry a guilt that wasn't mine. If something was wrong, then maybe I wasn't being the right wife. Had I stopped praying enough? Was God testing me? These questions consumed me as I tried to hold everything together. The weight of his decisions fell on my shoulders as if they were my spiritual responsibilities, as if the failure of a relationship were also somehow a sign of a failure in my faith. And so I continued, striving to keep alive a relationship that in practice no longer existed. It was as if I were alone within a covenant made for two, sustaining everything with prayers, fasting, and tears hidden in my pillow. And the most painful thing was knowing that, to the outside world, including within the church, everything seemed perfect. It was frustrating to feel that, even living a silent war, I had no room to cry out. Because the role of the Christian woman is often romanticized as one who endures everything silently, with faith and a smile. And I began to believe that suffering was a kind of sanctity. If this topic resonates with you, if at any point in my story you recognized yourself, then I ask you from the bottom of my heart to like this video. It seems like a small gesture, but it has a huge impact. When you like it, the algorithm understands that this type of content needs to reach more women. Women who, perhaps right now, are praying alone in the middle of the night, asking for an answer. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this message that, yes, can transform. Because no one should go through this kind of pain in silence. And when we come together, share, and identify, something powerful happens. We discover that we are not alone. What I experienced taught me that appearances can be a trap, that not everything that seems spiritual is actually healthy, and that a covenant, to be true, needs to have truth on both sides. But at the time, I still didn't see this. I was immersed in a maze of guilt, trying to prove to myself and to God that I deserved a restored marriage. And the further He pulled away, the closer I drew to God, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of being seen as a failure. Fear of admitting that everything I had built with such zeal was crumbling right before my eyes. The first signs didn't come like an earthquake. They came like small cracks, too subtle for those who don't want to see. They started with delays. He always had an excuse. Traffic, last-minute meetings, a church member who needed help. I believed him. I wanted to believe him, because when the heart is involved, it has the power to justify even what hurts. Then came the distancing. Conversations became quicker, shallower. His eyes always seemed to be somewhere else but on me. And when I asked if something was wrong, he'd say it was just fatigue, stress, too much responsibility. Words that, spoken with the right intonation, can hide even the most dangerous truths. At that moment, my mind was still trapped in a deeply distorted notion of submission. I believed that love meant enduring, that faith meant waiting in silence, that God's timing demanded almost supernatural patience from a woman. So I shut myself down. Every time something felt off, I'd scold myself internally. It's just a phase. God will act. Be wise. Be gentle. These phrases were like mantras I repeated to silence my intuition. And it's hard for me to admit. I felt it. Deep down, I knew. But I was so afraid of being unfair, of appearing suspicious, of contradicting the image he projected to everyone, that I preferred to stifle what my heart screamed between the lines. The mindset I carried didn't allow me to see clearly. I was trained to believe, not to question, to intercede, not to confront. And this placed me, without realizing it, in a position of constant vulnerability. As he offered empty excuses, I bent my knees once more. There was no room for suspicion, only prayer. And therein lies the danger. When faith becomes an emotional crutch, used to endure the unbearable in the name of a promise that may never have truly existed. I remember the day he forgot our wedding anniversary. I had prepared everything, filled the house with little details, written a sweet note. When he arrived, he just looked at me and said he wasn't in the mood, that he was tired. No flowers, no hugs, not a word. Just a heavy silence that screamed louder than any argument. And yet, do you know what I did? I kept quiet. I put on some soft worship music, went to my room, and prayed. I asked God to restore our love, to rekindle what was fading, to touch his heart and remind him of who we were. But deep down, I already knew. The problem wasn't forgetting a date. It was forgetting who I was to him. This was one of the hardest revelations of this journey. Understanding that when you have to constantly beg for scraps of attention, something is very wrong. And yet, for a long time, I remained. For fear of making a mistake, for fear of sinning, for fear of displeasing God by making a decision that, to me, felt like abandonment. And it is precisely this kind of fear that paralyzes us, that steals our voice, that pushes us into a place of emotional silence. A place where pain is spiritualized, as if suffering were proof of maturity. All of this had a direct impact on my self-esteem. I began to doubt my worth. I felt invisible, inadequate, as if I were failing as a wife, as a woman, as a Christian. I looked in the mirror and saw no sparkle in my eyes, only weariness disguised as faith. And even on days when sadness engulfed me, I still said, "It's just a phase. God will act." But to what extent was this waiting faith, and when did it become an escape? The answer to this question began to take shape when something even more difficult happened. It was during this phase that my spiritual surrender reached levels that, looking back now, blended despair with faith. I woke up every day at 3 in the morning, like someone making an appointment with God, hoping for an urgent answer. The house was silent, the children were asleep, and I was on my knees on the cold living room floor, crying out, weeping, tearing my soul apart. I read Proverbs as if each verse held the key to restoring my home. I didn't read out of habit. I read in search of a way out. I fasted for days at a time, in cycles, without telling anyone. It wasn't out of spiritual vanity. It was out of anguish. It was out of fear. It was out of that deep feeling that if I didn't surrender even more, everything would slip through my fingers. I truly believed that God was seeing my struggle, that He was testing my faith, that this pain had a hidden purpose. And the deeper I delved into this search, the further He withdrew. And it wasn't just physically. It was emotionally, spiritually, intimately. It was as if we were living in parallel worlds. Me at war, Him on the run. Me trying to keep the house afloat with prayer. Him constructing lies with the same skill He used to preach in church. And it crushed me, because while I gave myself completely, He lived as if nothing were wrong. It's hard to explain the emotional toll this takes on a woman. The kind of mental confusion that sets in when you seek God with all your might, and yet everything around you seems to keep crumbling. I felt like heaven was ignoring me, as if my prayers were hitting the ceiling and bouncing back. But even in the face of this emptiness, I didn't stop. On the contrary, I intensified. I began holding vigils alone. I spent entire nights in prayer. I would play softly, chant hymns, walk around the house making promises, anoint pillows, doors, photos, anything I could consecrate as a point of contact with the transformation I so desperately awaited. And all the while, He became increasingly distant, cold, and indifferent. Sometimes He even mocked me, subtly. He said I was exaggerating, that it was all fanaticism. He even said I was giving up being a woman to be a pastor, as if my spirituality had become a burden to Him. And that phrase cut me like a blade, because I believed He wanted a woman of prayer. I was sure that being a woman of God was what would attract Him most. But little by little, I realized the problem wasn't my faith. The problem was what it revealed about Him. Because as I drew closer to the light, He grew more uncomfortable. My surrender exposed His distance, and that's when a hidden truth began to form within me, still nebulous, but too uncomfortable to ignore. Maybe I was fighting alone. Maybe I was waging a spiritual war against something that didn't want to be restored, and it tore me apart inside because everything I did was driven by love, a love that at that point was no longer light, no longer healthy. It was love, mixed with attachment, with guilt, with the false idea that my sacrifice was necessary for God to act. And this belief had been ingrained in me for so long that I no longer knew how to differentiate faith from obsession. While I cried out for deliverance, He remained trapped, but not by demons. Trapped by His own choices, by the lies He hid so well, by the convenience of having a submissive woman at home while He did whatever He pleased outside. And yet, I couldn't escape. Because inside me, there was still the hope, or perhaps the illusion, that if I prayed just a little longer, He would return to being the man He'd been in the beginning. But time showed me that perhaps that man never truly existed, and that the transformation I so desperately sought wasn't His, it was mine. It was at this point in the journey that something happened, something that moved me in a definitive way. It was a normal afternoon, the kind where you don't expect anything different. He'd gone to a church appointment and left his phone at home, a rare occurrence. Something inside me stirred, and I fought that impulse for long minutes. It wasn't jealousy. It was a discomfort that had been growing silently for months. I picked up the phone with trembling hands, feeling my heart race as if something inside me already knew what it was about to find. I opened the screen, and the first notification was a message. It was wonderful last night. I miss you already. For a moment, everything stopped. The sounds around me faded. I felt like I was free-falling, as if the ground had disappeared. The saved name belonged to a woman I'd never heard of. A string of messages stretched across the screen. Some erased, others left there like exposed scars. I read and reread each word, trying to find some glitch to believe this was a misunderstanding, a mistake, a trap set by the enemy. I clung to every possibility before accepting the obvious. My husband was cheating on me. When he arrived, my face was already pale, my hands cold. I showed him my phone without saying a word. He looked at it, sighed deeply, and, as if in a rehearsed script, said it wasn't what it seemed, that she was exaggerating, that she was a sister new to the faith, in need, and that he was only trying to help. I stared at him silently, waiting for some spark of repentance to appear in his eyes, but it didn't. Instead, he turned the tables. He said I was being too suspicious, that my spiritual obsession was making me see demons where there weren't any, that I needed to trust him and God more. And I wanted to believe. Yes, I did, because admitting the truth at that moment would mean accepting that everything I had been fighting to preserve was, in fact, ruined, and accepting that was too heavy. So I swallowed the tears, the lump in my throat, and fell silent. I returned to my room, knelt again, and asked God to show me what I still couldn't see clearly. The truth was already there, wide open, but my mind, still trapped in a distorted logic of loyalty, insisted that I needed to fight, that being a Christian wife meant continuing to believe even when everything around me told me to stop. That day was a turning point. Not because I made an immediate decision, but because something inside me broke. And once you see what you previously ignored, there's no going back. I remained in that marriage for a while, clinging to the idea that maybe it was just a crisis, a stumble, something fixable. The word forgiveness rang loudly within me, like a sacred reminder. But something deeper also began to grow. The realization that forgiveness doesn't negate discernment, that forgiving doesn't mean ignoring, and that staying is sometimes more destructive than walking away. From then on, everything took on a different tone. Every absence carried a different weight. Every silence hid more than it said. And I began to live in a kind of constant state of alert, like someone walking on broken glass, trying to protect their feet, even though I knew the blood was already flowing. I still prayed, still fasted, still cried out, but now there was a shadow between me and God, a doubt that little by little became revelation. Because even with all my faith, even with all my spiritual effort, I could no longer deny what was before my eyes. And it was precisely in this context that something even more disturbing happened, something that completely wrenched me from denial and brought me face to face with a decision I didn't want, but could no longer postpone. It began subtly, like a thin mist that slowly fills the space without us realizing it. A comment here, a criticism disguised as spiritual guidance. There, I, already emotionally fragile, began to internalize everything as absolute truth. He said I needed to trust more, obey more, be more silent, as if my spirituality were directly linked to my ability to endure everything without question. And I accepted. Not because he wholeheartedly agreed, but because the idea of resisting seemed even more painful. It was as if, with each passing day, I was losing a piece of myself, and I didn't even realize how much this was distancing me from my own essence. Prayers became less about faith and more about survival. I no longer knelt in thanksgiving. I begged to endure. I fasted for deliverance, but I no longer knew from whom. From him? From myself? From the burden I carried alone? The truth is, that relationship had become a silent battlefield, and I was the target trying, at all costs, not to visibly bleed. And in the midst of it all, his speech of spiritual authority became armor to hold everything in place. His appearance, his reputation, his control. He said I needed to be a woman of faith, and being a woman of faith according to him meant enduring everything with a smile. If I cried, it was a lack of trust in God. If I questioned, it was rebellion. If I remained silent, it was spirituality. I lost myself in this twisted logic that confused submission with silence, patience with self-denial, forgiveness with erasure. And the cruelest thing about it all was that I began to believe it. Yes, I began to think the problem was really me, that I didn't pray enough, that my faith was weak, that perhaps God was using that pain to refine me, as if constant pain were the only language he knew how to speak. I began to watch my thoughts as if they were sins, blaming myself for human feelings like frustration, sadness, and exhaustion. I blamed myself for not being the ideal wife he so often said God expected, a wife who doesn't complain, who prays in silence, who endures, who understands, who welcomes even when ignored, betrayed, and dismissed. Spirituality, which had once been my refuge, became a burden, a place where I no longer found rest, but rather demand. And this demand didn't come from God. It came from the subtle manipulation of someone who used God's name to shield themselves from the consequences of their own actions. The most dangerous thing about this type of abuse is that it leaves no visible marks. No one sees, no one suspects. On the contrary, he was praised by many. A man of prayer, they said. An example? And me? I smiled in services, held his hand during praise, and pretended everything was fine. Because admitting that it wasn't would expose a wound no one had the strength to embrace. And deep down, I was afraid of not being understood. I was afraid of hearing that the mistake was mine, that I needed to bend my knee more, be more vigilant, believe more. This confusion between faith and blind submission creates invisible prisons. We remain not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of making mistakes, of sinning, of being judged. And when fear disguises itself as spirituality, it's all too easy to continue justifying the unjustifiable. I was trapped in a cycle that fueled guilt, nullified my identity, and robbed me of the freedom that Christ came to restore to us. But there, even suffocated, a seed began to germinate. Something inside me whispered, between tears, "This is not the gospel. This is not love. This is not God." And it was this whisper, still, fragile, still timid, that began to guide me down a path I never imagined I would take. I began to think that if anyone would understand me, it would be there, inside the church, in that environment where so many spoke of mercy, truth, and restoration. I truly believed I would find acceptance. But when I decided to seek help, what I found was a deafening silence, the kind of silence that doesn't console, that doesn't embrace, that doesn't heal. They told me to pray more, fast more, endure with faith. It's a spiritual attack, sister. The enemy wants to destroy your home. You need to wage war in secret. And then they turned their faces to the pulpit as if nothing had been said, as if the pain I carried could be swept under the spiritual rug with a glory to God. There I understood that often the problem isn't the lack of faith, but the way it's manipulated. The church I loved so much became, at that moment, a place where wounds needed to be hidden to maintain the appearance of holiness, as if talking about betrayal were a greater affront than experiencing it, as if preserving a leader's image were more important than healing the wounded soul of a woman who no longer knew where to lean on. And this profoundly changed my mindset because it made me realize that there's a hidden truth behind many beautiful speeches. Sometimes, the spiritualization of pain is just a disguised way of avoiding confronting reality. I looked around and saw women in broken marriages, but they all wore the same practiced smile as if showing any sign of vulnerability was forbidden. And deep down, I knew they had no one to talk to either. It was as if there was a collective pact of silence where everyone knew something was wrong, but no one had the courage to break that structure. And when I tried to express what was happening, they told me to be careful what I said, because words have power, as if denouncing what hurt me were the real sin, as if the wound had to be silenced in the name of faith. And that was where my inner revolution began, because I realized that remaining silent was to condone a sickening logic. I began to understand that the gospel is not a theater of perfection, but a place where truth liberates. But this freedom comes at a high price when it threatens structures, when it interferes with the backstage of religion, when it exposes what many people prefer to keep hidden, that yes, there is pain within churches. There are abuses that are covered up with verses. There are leaders who, instead of welcoming, impose silence. And there are women, many women, who are taught to endure everything in the name of a distorted submission that has nothing to do with the heart of Christ. It was at this point in my journey that something inside me broke completely, and at the same time, something new began to emerge, a kind of courage that didn't come from physical strength or rebellion, but from a calm and profound conviction. I needed to break out of that cycle, not just for myself, but because remaining in it was perpetuating a lie. The hardest, yet most liberating revelation was realizing that God doesn't condone the silence that protects sin. He walks alongside truth. He reveals himself in pain, yes, but not so that we remain in it, but so that we can move through it, transform, denounce it, and be reborn. And it is in this rebirth that much changes, including the way we view faith. It was as if the ground had opened up beneath my feet, and, at the same time, everything made sense. That strange feeling that had been with me for so long, that intuition stifled by prayers and desperate attempts to maintain faith, finally materialized before my eyes. It wasn't just a suspicion. It wasn't an exaggeration on my part, as he always made it seem. It was real. He had another family, another home, another wife, other children, and more than that, another life being built while mine was being deconstructed. Slowly, silently. The impact was so violent that, for a moment, not even the pain came immediately. It was as if my body was trying to protect me from the intensity of what it meant. A part of me simply froze, and I found myself there, standing, facing a truth that screamed louder than any justification, any excuse, any promises of change. The naked, raw, and definitive truth. While I struggled on my knees, he smiled elsewhere. While I broke down in nights of prayer, he built sandcastles with another woman. While I sought answers from God, he fed me lies with utter coldness. I remember the physical sensation in my body, trembling, chills in my spine, my legs nearly giving out. But what really hurt was the shock to my soul. The breaking of a covenant I took seriously. The realization that I had been loyal while being betrayed, that I had been faithful while being deceived, that I had carried guilt that wasn't mine, while he wrote hidden chapters of our story, chapters where I wasn't even mentioned. And yet, I still wondered if it was right to feel angry. The mentality I'd been taught for so long made me question even my most legitimate feelings, as if indignation were a sin, as if breaking with the farce were a rebellion against God. But what I experienced there was the beginning of a much deeper revelation. Faith didn't ask me to remain silent in the face of injustice. True faith didn't force me to continue in a cycle that destroyed my dignity. It was at that point that something inside me broke. But this time, it was different. It was no longer the kind of break that paralyzes. It was the kind of rupture that opens space for a new path, a kind of inner rebirth. However timid, however wounded, a new awareness began to emerge within me. I stopped looking for answers in his actions and began to listen to what God had been whispering within me for a long time, but which I had silenced out of fear. The decision to leave that relationship no longer felt like an escape. It was, in fact, an act of integrity, a rediscovery of truth, a necessary break between what was superficial and what, in fact, needed to blossom. And as contradictory as it may seem, it was in this moment of greatest disillusionment that I experienced a kind of clarity I'd never known before. His double life didn't just expose his marital betrayal, it exposed the entire fabric of lies that sustained that marriage. It revealed the backstory of a story I'd fought hard to keep afloat, but which only held together because I was the only one fighting. He hadn't even bothered to hide it completely. It was as if, deep down, he knew I would never make the decision to leave, as if the certainty of my fidelity authorized him to do whatever he wanted. But there, faced with that stark truth, the tables turned. I no longer needed to convince myself of anything. The mask had fallen, and reality, however harsh, was the only possible path to transformation. There was no more room for half-truths, for solitary attempts, for justifying the unjustifiable. It was time to honor my own journey, to rescue the woman I'd left forgotten behind so many prayers, empty advice, and promises that never materialized. And it was from this pain, this truth exposed without anesthesia, that I began to understand that. I screamed at God, not in prayer, not silently, not in a pent-up outburst. I truly screamed, with everything I had, with my soul raw, unfiltered, unafraid of appearing ungrateful or disrespectful. I screamed because I reached a point where the pain surpassed any doctrine, because, faced with everything that had happened, I could no longer maintain that image of unshakable faith that I had been taught to wear as a shield for so long. The pain was too real, too raw, too strong, and the question burning inside me was, where was God in all this? I had done everything right, everything. I surrendered myself, body, soul, and spirit. I was obedient. I was submissive. I was patient. I was the one who forgave, who prayed, who believed. In change, I didn't turn my back. I didn't give up easily. I went all the way. And when the end came, it didn't come as relief. It came as ruin. So I questioned, and questioned out loud. Because deep down, I needed to understand if the God I'd been taught about was truly the God who was with me in that pain. Had he abandoned me? Was everything I believed in a lie? Had I been used, manipulated, sacrificed in the name of something that only made sense to others? It was during this crisis that I realized a hidden truth no one told me. True faith is not blind. It is not conformity. It is not self-effacement disguised as spirituality. Faith, when it is real, is alive. And because it is alive, it also bleeds. It also feels anger. It also cries on the bedroom floor, unsure if it will be able to get up the next day. And it was precisely during this breakdown that something new began to happen within me. I didn't find God where I was told he would be. I found him in the opposite. In the midst of my fury, my confusion, my revolt, it was as if he were saying, finally, you're being honest. Finally, you're being whole. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to appear strong before him. I was simply being who I was, a woman who was hurt, confused, tired, and yet hungry for answers that were true. It was at that moment that my mindset began to shift. I stopped trying to understand God through the lens of others, and I began seeking a real, raw, personal connection, not with the God of religiosity, but with the God of truth, the God who didn't demand perfection from me, but presence, who didn't demand silence from me, but sincerity. My crisis with God wasn't the end of my faith. It was the beginning of a transformation, because the faith born after a breakdown is much more solid than that which merely follows rules. It's built on truths faced, painful decisions, revelations we'd rather not have, but which once exposed, liberate. And that's when I began to understand that God was never absent. He just wasn't where I was looking for him. In the effort to nullify myself, in the fear of making mistakes, in the desire to please others in his name. He was always with me, even when I questioned him, and perhaps especially then. Because, contrary to what I was taught, God is not scandalized by our pain. He is not offended by our cries. He does not withdraw when we are too sincere. On the contrary, it is when we drop the character, dismantle the pose, shatter the altar, we built based on fear and guilt, that he draws near, that he whispers, that he heals. And it was there, amidst the rubble of what I believed to be faith, that I began to build a true relationship with him, without molds, without masks, without fear, just me and him, for the first time, at peace with my anger, at peace with my tears, at peace with my humanity. And it was in this new, fragile, and sincere place that a light began to dawn, not out there, but within. I found myself alone, not alone, in the sense of having no one around, but alone in a way only those who have been there understand. It was as if the world had collapsed from the inside out. My small children were sleeping in the next room, and I was there, sitting on the cold bathroom floor, hugging my knees, trying to breathe between sobs. I was broken in so many places, in my tired body, in my overwhelmed mind, in my soul that no longer knew what to believe in. There was no script for that kind of pain. No one teaches you how to get through the end of a marriage when you gave everything you had to keep it from ending. No one prepares you to rebuild your life while holding on to other lives that depend on you. And there, on that floor, without makeup, without answers, without plans, I found a different silence. Not that silence of abandonment, but a silence that, for the first time in a long time, didn't demand anything of me. I didn't need to be strong. I didn't need to be spiritual. I didn't need to be the woman who endures everything. I just needed to be there, whole in my pain. That's when I realized something that completely changed my way of seeing everything. Grief is also sacred. Mourning for what ended, for what wasn't, for what I dreamed and didn't live. Mourning for the version of myself that believed until the end, and that had to die, so another could be born. People talk about starting over as if it were a magic button, a click, a sudden turnaround. But the truth is, starting over hurts. Because before you can start over, you have to face the loss. And loss, however necessary, is a process. It's not just the end of a relationship, it's the end of an identity. I was no longer a wife. I was no longer that woman who had a traditional home. I was someone else, still confused, still hurt, but slowly, curiously alive. It's strange to say this, but on that cold floor, amidst tears and confused memories, an invisible turning point began. It wasn't a heavenly vision, nor an audible answer from the heavens. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but profoundly real. God didn't speak to me. God sustained me. And that, for me, had a much greater impact. Because when all seemed lost, He didn't give me a ready-made path. He gave me breath. He gave me space. He gave me permission to feel everything. He held me close through the courage that little by little welled up from within. A small, timid, but insistent courage. And that's where true transformation begins. When we understand that we don't have to be well to start over. That the strength that lifts us up doesn't come from sudden motivation, but from the daily decision not to give up. It was in this silent backstage that my mindset began to shift. I stopped seeking approval from others. I stopped trying to fulfill expectations that were never mine. And I began, truly, to listen to myself, to ask what made sense for me, for my story, for who I was becoming. On this new journey, I discovered layers of myself that had been buried by years of blind obedience, of guilt disguised as faith, of renunciations never asked of me with words, but demanded with looks and judgments. I began to realize that a new beginning doesn't begin outside. It begins within. It begins when we accept that we no longer need to prove anything to anyone, that living truthfully is more valuable than living with applause, that being whole is better than being perfect. And it was in this place of silent reconstruction that I took my first steps, one at a time, staggering, unsure, but real. And each step had meaning, not because I already knew where it would lead, but because I had decided not to stay where I was. And that in itself was a miracle. And then, as time passed and the wounds slowly healed, something inside me began to change. At first, it was just a whisper, a gentle intuition that there was something inside me that was still whole after all, as if, even amidst the rubble of a life that had collapsed, there still existed a seed waiting for light. I was no longer the same, and curiously, this gave me peace, because in that woman who was being reborn, between sleepless nights and profound silences, there was a new awareness, an intimate and inalienable revelation. I had value. Not for what I did or for who I was trying to please, but for the simple fact of existing. I discovered over time that strength lies not in the pose of someone who appears unshakable, but in the honesty of someone who admits they've been hurt, and yet chooses to continue. This was one of the greatest mindset transformations I've ever experienced. I no longer needed to hide behind an "it's okay" message while my inner world screamed. I didn't need to feign stability to be loved. The truth, however uncomfortable, was the safest path I could take, because where there is truth, there is freedom. And that was exactly what I began to experience. A freedom without noise, but one that brought me back to myself. The most curious thing is that, in this process of rediscovery, I discovered God in a completely new way. Not the God of immediate answers or ready-made speeches, but the God who endures, who respects time, who isn't offended by my questions, who doesn't expect performance, but presence. And it was in this rawer, more human relationship that I understood something I never imagined I'd say with such conviction. God does not condone lies, nor abuse, nor oppression disguised as religiosity. He is just, He is truth, He is love. And true love would never make me feel inferior to fit into a place that existed only on the basis of control. This awareness freed me, because until then, I thought being a Christian meant silently accepting everything, swallowing everything with a smile, effacing myself in the name of a faith that felt more like a burden. But God began untying these knots, teaching me with grace and firmness that being His is not being a doormat, that submission is not blind servitude, that forgiveness does not require continuous coexistence with those who choose to hurt. It was a reality check, yes, but it was also a balm, because for the first time I understood that my worth was not in the approval of others, but in the identity He Himself gave me. This revelation changed the way I look at myself. It changed the way I position myself. It changed the type of relationship I'm willing to build. Because when we see ourselves through God's eyes, not through the distorted filters of past wounds, we stop accepting crumbs. We learn to say no without guilt, to set boundaries without fear of losing love. Because true love doesn't suffocate, it doesn't manipulate, it doesn't corrode. True love heals, strengthens, and builds. And on this journey of rebuilding, I also learned that being strong isn't about walking alone. That courage often means knowing how to ask for help, allowing yourself to be cared for, looking in the mirror with all the scars visible, and still seeing beauty. Real beauty, not dependent on makeup or perfection, beauty born from lived truth, from the behind-the-scenes experience no one saw, but which was the stage for my overcoming. Of course, not everything was a bed of roses. There were still setbacks, days when everything seemed to be starting over from scratch, but there was something different about me, a firm resolve not to turn back. I had already gone too deep within myself to settle for superficialities. And this, as challenging as it was liberating. Because each new decision aligned with this truth brought me closer to the woman I was becoming. A more whole woman, more attentive, more self-aware. And it was in this flow of self-knowledge, restored faith and strengthened identity, that something new began to blossom. And it was in this process of reconstruction, where every part of me seemed to be reattached with more purpose and awareness, that I began to see God through different eyes. Not the eyes that religion often teaches us to have, full of fear, guilt, and unquestionable rules, but through the eyes of someone who truly allowed themselves to experience pain and, even so, continued to embrace it. I came from a rigid faith, where obedience was often confused with blind submission, where questioning was synonymous with rebellion, and suffering in silence seemed like a kind of proof of holiness. But there, in the midst of my rawest chaos, I discovered a hidden truth that completely transformed my spiritual perception. God never asked me to nullify myself. He doesn't save marriages at the cost of destroying souls. That sentence struck me like a revelation. For so long, I thought that if I sacrificed enough, if I endured quietly, if I prayed more, if I fasted more, then maybe God would be pleased and save the relationship. But it was precisely in the collapse, in the moment when everything fell apart, that He showed me something much deeper. He wasn't trying to save face. He was trying to save me. And that changed everything, because it made me understand that God's heart beats for people, not structures. The truth is, for a long time, I spent trying to please an image of God that was based more on other people's expectations than on who He really is. And do you know what the biggest shock was? Realizing that He didn't demand silence in the face of injustice. Quite the opposite. God has never been silent in the face of human pain. He isn't a cold spectator of our tears. He gets involved. He cares. He confronts what needs to be confronted. And he gave me, gently and courageously, the permission I needed to also say, this isn't right. Because yes, God loves the truth, and not a disguised, convenient truth adapted to the comfort of those who don't want change, but the truth that liberates, that exposes what needs healing, that breaks cycles of oppression and illuminates dark corners of the soul. And this was one of the biggest turning points in my journey, realizing that faith is not an invitation to passivity, but to transformation, to a kind of internal alignment that no longer tolerates living behind a facade, that no longer condones what hurts, even if it comes with a verse attached. And that's how I felt deeply loved, not when I was well-groomed, feigning control, trying to show that everything was under control, but when I completely fell apart, when I cried on the floor, when I was transparent, even in my despair. God didn't turn away. He didn't back down. He didn't wait for me to fix myself. He loved me there, in the midst of pain, at rock bottom, at the height of grief. It was in this true place that his love reached me most powerfully. And it wasn't a love that patted me on the head to keep me going through cycles that made me sick. It was a love that called me out of the cave, that said, get up, I'm with you. His presence sustained me when everything else seemed to fail. Because when we're disappointed by people, institutions, even our own decisions, what's left? In my case, it was him, only him. And perhaps this is the most powerful point of this entire journey, realizing that God doesn't leave us when we fail. He isn't scandalized by our weaknesses. He remains our Father, and this has a huge impact on how we begin to see life, our choices, our paths. It's funny how, when everything falls apart, certainties that once seemed absolute begin to dissolve, and in their place, God plants the seeds of something new. It's not automatic. It's not always visible at first, but little by little, over time, with the reconnections that pain fosters, we begin to realize that we are lighter, that we are more whole, that we are closer to him, not because we did everything right, but because we were truthful. And when this awareness truly sets in, it changes everything. It changes the way we pray. It changes the way we trust. It changes the way we walk. And it was precisely when I began to walk more firmly in the process of my own healing that the weight of others' judgment came down hard. It's funny how, when we begin to rebuild, someone always appears with a ready-made opinion, with biblical advice on the tip of their tongue, with empty phrases trying to explain a story they've never lived. I heard it all. You should have fought harder. You should have forgiven 70 times 7. You threw away your marriage. And each sentence hurt, as if it were ripping open the wound I was trying to heal. The cruelest thing was that many of these words came wrapped in spirituality, as if faith were an argument to keep me trapped, as if God expected more sacrifice, more renunciation, more silence from me. But no one, absolutely no one, knew what it was like to live in fear dressed in faith. And therein lies one of the hardest truths of this journey. Appearances are very deceiving. On the outside, I was the devoted wife, the steadfast Christian, the woman of prayer. On the inside, I was a sick, suffocating soul, trying to survive in an environment that undermined my dignity every day. And when I finally found the courage to break out of this cycle, it wasn't because I lacked forgiveness. It was because, for the first time in a long time, I understood that God was also calling me to live, and not just to endure. People judge because it's easier to criticize a decision than to sit down and hear the story behind it. And often, what appears to be a lack of effort on the surface is actually the height of courage. Because leaving a place where everyone and everything tells you you should stay is one of the loneliest and bravest decisions anyone can make, especially when that place is called home. Especially when you've been taught that your worth lies in keeping everything together, even when you're sinking inside. There's a hidden truth here that few have the courage to face. Not all suffering is a cross. Not all pain is God's will, and enduring isn't always synonymous with faith. I've learned that, often, people's judgments reveal more about them than about us. They reveal limited empathy, the rush to give ready-made answers, the discomfort of dealing with narratives that deviate from the norm. And when we decide to break out of this script and live something more authentic, it's uncomfortable, because it challenges the mindset that there's only one right way to be a Christian, a woman, a wife. And I no longer fit into these molds. I began to realize that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, that my story didn't need to be validated by those who didn't cry with me, by those who didn't see behind the scenes, by those who only arrived after the earthquake, wanting to offer their opinion on the rubble. This freedom that began to blossom within me wasn't arrogance, it was survival. It was healing, it was transformation. Because when we stop trying to explain ourselves, we begin to save energy for what truly matters. We begin to look ahead with more clarity. We begin to connect with other women who are also tired of pretending, who have already understood that being strong isn't about enduring everything, but having the wisdom to say, so far. And I found myself surrounded by these women, some quiet, others still in the midst of conflict, but all with one thing in common. They were awakening. And this creates an invisible network of empathy that judgment will never understand. A silent sisterhood among those who decided to live truthfully, even if it meant breaking with patterns and enduring dirty looks. And it's impressive how, in this place of authenticity, God continues to be God, present, loving, just, without demanding that you return to prison in the name of pity, without expecting you to annul yourself in the name of a marriage that was never a covenant, but rather a prison in disguise. He continues to be the God of grace, but also of justice. And it was this revelation that began to shape a new mindset. Today, when I look back at my life, I realize that it wasn't the end that destroyed me. It was the end that repositioned me. I didn't lose everything. I was rescued. Today, I'm rebuilding, brick by brick, with more truth, more discernment, and a peace I'd only heard about before. Jesus didn't pull me out of the storm to place me in a fairy tale. He set me on a firm path, still with challenges, but now with ground. And it's different to walk this way, with a joy that doesn't depend on appearances, with a lightness that comes not from what people say, but from what He says. I'm smiling again from the inside out. I still serve. I'm still in the church, but without masks, without chains, without needing to prove myself worthy. He didn't return me to an old version of myself. He's revealing a new one. And this journey of rediscovery, this process of spiritual rebirth, makes me see that there is abundant life after pain, a life that doesn't ignore the scars, but learns to honor them as marks of transformation. If you're listening to all this, with a heavy heart, with tears you didn't even know were still there, I want you to know, you are not alone. Maybe you're praying in the silence of the early morning, trying to fast for a miracle while betrayal tears at your soul from within. Maybe you're struggling to maintain appearances, to sustain a structure that seems spiritual but consumes you inside. I've been there. And what I can tell you, with all the truth I carry today, is that God doesn't call you to die in a place where He no longer dwells. He doesn't demand sacrifices that violate your essence. The weight that suffocates you, nor the fear that silences you, is not His. If no one else sees, He sees. If no one else understands, He understands. There is a hidden truth behind some crosses we carry, thinking it's faith, when in fact it's control, manipulation, and guilt. But when we allow God's light to invade even these hidden areas, everything begins to change. It is in this place that a new journey begins, a journey of real restoration, where grace does not mask, it transforms.